You know, we've all seen the courtroom dramas on TV. It seems so clear-cut, right? But have you ever really stopped to think about how a court, with all its messy evidence and conflicting stories, actually decides what the truth is? It's this process that our entire society is built on, and believe me, it is way more complicated and way more human than you probably think.
So let's get right into it. We're going to try to answer the big question here. How does the law really find the truth? And what you're going to see is that there's no simple formula. It's really a journey, one that mashes together logic, psychology, and even a little bit of storytelling.
And to get our heads around it, we're going to follow the exact path a fact finder takes. First, we'll start the quest itself. Then, we'll look at how the law even gets read in the first place. We'll see how clues and evidence get pieced together, and then we'll have to face the human element, our own biases. After that, we'll see how a compelling story gets built, and finally, we'll try to figure out what this legal truth really means for justice.
Okay, so right off the bat, we've got a huge challenge. The legal system has to figure out what happened in the past. It's kind of like trying to assemble a giant, complicated puzzle, but half the pieces are missing, and the ones you do have are faded and don't quite fit together. You're relying on memories, scraps of paper, and people's biased stories to create one single definitive picture. It's a tough job.
So let's do this. I want you to put yourself in the shoes of a judge or a juror. For the next few minutes, you are the fact finder. Your whole job is to cut through all the noise and find the signal of truth. Let's start the journey.
So where do we start? Well, every journey needs a map. In the legal world, that map is the written law, the statutes. But just like an old treasure map, it's not always clear. It needs to be interpreted. And as we're about to see, there are two totally different ways of thinking about how to do that.
So right here, you see this massive split in how to even think about the law. On one side, you've got textualism. A textualist judge basically says, look, I just care about what the words on the page say. They're sticking to the plain, ordinary meaning. But on the other hand, you've got a pragmatist, and they're asking a totally different question. What's going to give us the best outcome in the real world? They're thinking about fairness, what's efficient, what's good for everybody. It's the exact same law, but two completely different starting points for the journey.
Okay, so we've got our map of the law. Now we need to start gathering our clues, the evidence. But how do you actually connect the dots? How do you build a logical chain that gets you from a piece of evidence to a final conclusion? Well, this is where logic is supposed to come in, but it gets a little weird.
And here's the fundamental problem. Every single piece of evidence, every link in your argument is resting on some kind of assumption. So let's say a witness saw the defendant running away from the crime scene. The assumption is, well, guilty people run away. But is that always true? Maybe they were scared. Maybe they were running for another reason. The second you start poking at those assumptions, as this quote says, the whole argument can feel like it's built on shifting sand.
So just how strong is your chain of evidence really? Well, there's a mathematical way to think about it called the product rule. It says you have to multiply the certainty of each link. So if you're 80% sure of one thing and 80% sure of the next, your combined confidence just dropped to 64%. Add a few more links, and pretty soon you're certain of almost nothing. But then there's another way, the min rule, that feels much more like how we actually think. It says a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. That feels more intuitive, right? One shaky part of a story doesn't destroy the whole thing. It just makes the whole story only as believable as that one weak spot.
And this leads to this absolutely brilliant, kind of cynical quote from a legal expert. We love to talk about direct evidence. You know, like an eyewitness who points and says, I saw him do it. We think that's foolproof. But is it? It still requires a whole chain of inferences. Do we trust their eyesight? Their memory? Are they lying? The reality is, pretty much all evidence is circumstantial. It all requires us to take a little leap of faith.
And all of this leads us to the biggest wild card in the entire system, the human mind. The law can set up all the rules and procedures at once, but at the end of the day, a person, a human being, has to make the final call. And that person brings their whole life with them, all their experiences, their gut feelings, and yeah, their hidden biases.
You know, we'd love for fact-finding to be this precise, logical calculation, like punching numbers into a computer. But what researchers have found is that it's actually more of a black box. A judge or a juror listens to everything. And then, through this process that's almost entirely intuitive, they just form a belief. It's been called a stab at the truth. It's this incredibly powerful form of thinking, but it's also mysterious and, yeah, it can be wrong.
And this human black box has some common glitches.
You, as the fact finder, might fall into the trap of confirmation bias, where you only pay attention to the evidence that confirms what you already think is true. Or a lawyer might use anchoring bias on you, throwing out some huge dollar amount, hoping that number just gets stuck in your head. And of course, there's hindsight bias, where after it's all over, the outcome seems like it was totally obvious all along. These are the little mental traps that are waiting for all of us.
So, is intuition always a bad thing? No, not at all. And this is where it gets really interesting. The key difference is experience. Look at how experts, like radiologists or grandmaster chess players, think. An expert radiologist looks at an X-ray and sees meaningful patterns, while a novice just sees a bunch of gray blobs. An expert chess player instantly knows which couple of squares on the board matter most. They've put in so many hours that they've developed a trained intuition. It's like a cognitive superpower.
So let's recap. You've got your interpretation of the law, you've pieced together your evidence, and you're trying to watch out for your own biases. Now what? Well, just dumping a pile of facts on someone isn't going to convince them of anything. You need a story. And lawyers, well, they're professional storytellers. And they have a classic recipe for telling that story. It's called IRAC. It's an incredibly powerful way to bring order to all the chaos. First, you state the issue. What is the one question we're trying to answer? Then, you ground it in the rule. What specific law are we talking about here? The real magic happens in the application, where you weave your facts into that rule. And all of that leads to a conclusion that feels totally inevitable. See? It's not just a list of facts. It's a persuasion machine.
All right, we've followed the whole path. The fact finder has heard all the stories, they've weighed the evidence, and now they're ready to make a call. But what does that verdict actually represent? What's the connection between this legal truth and our bigger ideas about justice?
To really get this, we need to understand a key legal term: material fact. A material fact isn't the evidence itself. It's not the blurry photo or the testimony. It's the core thing the evidence is trying to prove. For example, the driver ran the red light. The witness saying they saw it is the evidence. The driver actually running the light is the material fact. The verdict is a decision on those core facts. But here is one last crucial piece to this puzzle. Sometimes an injustice happens not because of a bad law, but because of the fact-finding process itself. As this quote suggests, it can come down to how we listen and who we decide to believe.
This is called epistemic injustice. It's a fancy term for when someone is wronged specifically as a source of knowledge. It happens when a fact finder, maybe without even realizing it, gives less weight, less credibility to what someone says because of stereotypes about their race, their gender, their background. And in those moments, a terrible injustice can happen, not because the law itself is unfair, but because someone's truth was dismissed before it even had a chance.
So we kind of end up right back where we started. The law's quest for truth isn't some mechanical process. It's a deeply, profoundly human one. It's built by interpreting words, by linking clues with imperfect logic, and by telling stories that persuade, all of it filtered through that mysterious black box of the human mind. So the final question for all of us is, if legal truth is a human creation, vulnerable to our own flaws and biases, what does that really mean for justice?